Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, for spending your lunch hour with us. Today is one part of 3 classes as a part of our plant diagnostics training course for, I'm calling it Fall 2024. We're almost to fall, not quite yet. Today, our topic is diagnosing plant problems. So it's going to be a little bit of an introduction to plant diagnostics, and then we're going to delve into topics related to plant damage caused by insects and mites, since that's my specialty. So my name is Madeline Potter. If we haven't met before, I'm a faculty specialist for entomology and integrated pest management with the University of Maryland Extension Home and Garden Information Center. So part of my role is to educate the public and to train University of Maryland faculty and staff and volunteers on topics such as beneficial insect conservation and sustainable insect pest management. So let's go ahead and get started. So a little reminder about this 3-part training course. It is designed for you to attend or watch all 3 classes. So you're doing step 1, you're attending the first one. Each class is the second Wednesday of each month, September through November, from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. They're all virtual over Zoom, and they will be recorded. Here is our schedule. Today is September 11th. We're going to be going through diagnosing plant problems. Next month on October 9th, we'll talk about insect identification. And then on November 13th, we'll get into integrated pest management. So ways to sustainably manage the pests, maybe the causal agents we're finding that's causing our plant problems, learning how to guide others to choose sustainable insect pest management, and then getting into that piece of working with the public, especially if we are someone who's a master gardener volunteer or working with the public in some capacity. So as we get started, I wanted to put up the university's assurance statement along with our And Justice for All poster. Provides you with contact information if you have any questions about the accessibility of today's program. And since we are an organization that partners with federal, state, and local governments, we are required to collect anonymous demographic information on all individuals who participate in any of our programs. This is what we call a self-identification survey. This is completely anonymous and optional. So I'm going to launch that poll within Zoom now. It is 9 questions. All of these are optional. You'll notice for some of the questions, you have the option to choose prefer not to answer. This is completely anonymous. This information is kept confidential, and we use this information to help measure the effectiveness of our inclusive outreach efforts. So we'll take a couple minutes here for you to fill out that self-identification survey. Thank you for taking the time to fill out that survey. If you are still filling it out, feel free to continue to do so. I also have a quick 4-question pre-quiz. This is just a small check-in before we begin to absorb and take in some information about plant diagnostics. So I'm going to launch that as well. Just a quick 4 questions. So I just launched that pre-quiz, quick 4 questions. If for any reason you cannot respond to these questions because of technical difficulties, don't worry. No worries. We'll just move on in a minute or two.
Maddie, there was a note in the chat about not being able to see the pre-quiz. I just wanted to note that if folks can't see it, try checking behind some of the other windows that are open on your computer because the polls open as a pop-up, so sometimes they can get buried behind some of the other things that might be open on your screen.
For sake of time, we'll move forward, but if you're still continuing to answer those 4 questions, feel free to do so. And if you still can't see the quiz, no worries. It was just a quick check-in, so no problem at all. So an overview of today's topics. We'll first start with an introduction talking about the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, and why of plant diagnostics. Then we'll get into the how for how we practice plant diagnostics, which includes gathering information. Then we'll delve into recognizing plant damage caused by insects and mites. And then we'll conclude with practicing our plant diagnostic skills. Let's start with the introduction, the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. So I want for you to take a moment and to think about why you signed up for today's class, why you want to learn more about plant diagnostics. So who practices plant diagnostics? This can be anyone, especially anyone that deals with plants and plant health. You could be a master gardener volunteer. You could be a trained plant diagnostician. You could be a professional horticulturalist, a landscaper, or someone that simply has houseplants or a garden or some potted plants on your porch. So this is anyone who wants to build upon their plant diagnostic skills and to learn more about caring for their plants. So you do not have to be an expert. And I bring this up because I want to encourage all of you to help others when it comes to building plant diagnostic skills. It doesn't matter what age anyone is. It could be young kids. It could be our peer when we're walking outside with them, or maybe they're checking out some of our houseplants. It can be a great way to connect with someone and to help them connect with the green spaces around them, to point out what we'll learn about different signs and symptoms, different insects, different plant problems. So what is plant diagnostics? Plant diagnostics has many different definitions, but some of the two main ones I wanted to highlight today include the process of determining why a plant is not healthy or has a plant problem. Also, the plant process to come up with the best possible explanation of why a plant is not healthy. So it's an investigation. All of us are going to become plant detectives today. So put on your detective hat, get out your magnifying glass or your hand lens. We're going to investigate. And this is a process when it comes to plant diagnostics. We're not always going to be able to quickly identify what is causing a plant problem, but that's the fun part of it all, is we get to explore, get curious, and to collect clues, as we'll learn today, to lead us to a potential, what we call causal agent, the organism that is causing our plant problem, or maybe it's a non-living thing that's causing our plant problem. When can we practice plant diagnostics? This can be done year-round. It doesn't have to be just during our warm growing season months. As long as we have plants and clues present where we're having plant problems, we can practice plant diagnostics. And it comes back to maybe our house plants are having problems during the winter time. Maybe we have a greenhouse, so we have year-round growing happening, which means we potentially have year-round pests and pathogens. And so this can be done at any time of year. And this can also be an ongoing process. As we'll learn next month when we talk more about our insects and arthropods particularly, they have different life cycles and life stages. And sometimes it's an ongoing process to target different life stages as we go through the different seasons and years. We could also have a returning plant problem where we need to combat it every year or every season. And plant diagnostics can be a part of our monitoring practices. We'll learn about that when we talk about integrative pest management. Monitoring is one thing we can do when it comes to being on the lookout for potential plant problems or even causes of plant problems. Where can we practice plant diagnostics? So as you may guess, it's anywhere where we have plants. So this can be outdoors, it can be indoors, it could be in a greenhouse, it can be wherever you have your plants. So that can include a porch, a balcony, it could be on your windowsill, or maybe you have a vegetable garden in your backyard or a container bed with herbs, so anywhere where you have plants. Why do we practice plant diagnostics? We could have a whole class just on this, but I wanted to bring up some key points as to why plant diagnostics can be really important when it comes to managing plant health. The first key point I want to bring up is not all control measures work on all types of pests and problems. And I'll show an example here to demonstrate this. So we have on the screen, bottom left, a photo of a cherry leaf. And I want for you to look at this cherry leaf, observe anything that looks unusual, maybe something we'd consider a plant problem. So we may notice what's unusual is the holes that we're seeing in this leaf. And our first assumption might be that we have some sort of insect or animal that has chewed these leaves in this cherry leaf. And so someone might think, okay, I think it's an insect chewing the leaves, so I'm going to apply a pesticide, which is a chemical that's targeted to killing insects or pests, so pesticide. So they spray this chemical on their cherry tree, hoping it's going to get rid of the problem and get rid of the organism that's chewing these holes in their plants. Well, if they gathered more information, went through the plant diagnostic process, as we'll learn today, they would have found out that these holes were not created by an insect or a pest. It was actually created by a disease called cherry shot hole disease, fairly common for our cherry trees. And so this pesticide is not going to help mitigate our disease that we have on our plant. So we could continue to see these symptoms of holes in the leaves. And without going down the effects of pesticides too much, when we use control measures that we don't necessarily need in our landscape, that can lead to non-target effects. And for instance, when we're applying chemicals, these could negatively impact other animals such as pollinators and beneficial insects. So it's really important to use plant diagnostics and to lead us to an accurate identification of the causal agent. Also, incorrect control measures can lead to time, money, and even plant loss. If we're not caring for the actual causal agent, it could lead to further decline in plant health. Sometimes no control measures are needed. As we'll learn more and more, and we're learning about our insects, there are beneficial insects out there, and even our insects that feed on our plants can be beneficial because they help to feed other insects and predators in our landscapes. So sometimes, depending on the type of damage and the amount of damage we're seeing, sometimes the most sustainable method is to leave that insect be and to tolerate the damage, especially if it's not significantly impacting our plant's health. So that's why it's important to get that accurate ID so we know maybe we choose the more sustainable option, and maybe that's to do no type of control. And overall, with plant diagnostics, we are learning how to care for our plants, learning how to support plant health, and then in turn supporting the environment of our ecosystems, which is a very cool and exciting thing. So now that we went through our 5 W's, we're going to get into the how. How do we practice plant diagnostics? That leads us to our second topic of gathering information. I want for you to put on your detective hat. We are all plant detectives today. If you need a moment, take a stretch as we get into our next topic of gathering information. So this is the fun part. We get to be CSI detectives. We don't have to do this ourselves either. We can pull in our peers, our fellow volunteers, our coworkers. Maybe we have grandkids or kids ourselves or nieces and nephews. This can be a fun process as we gather the clues to figure out what is going on with our plants. And generally, the more relevant information we know, the better. And so this is a list of things we can use to develop our knowledge base, to put our clues together, to create a file on our situation. And the first important thing we can do when it comes to our plant is to know the identification of our plant. This goes beyond, it's just a plant, it's just an herb, it's just a tree. We want to get as specific as an idea as possible. And we'll talk about that and why that's important in a little bit. Also identifying the plant problem itself, describing it, especially if we have a client coming up to us at, say, an Ask a Master Gardener or plant clinic table, having them describe it to us, even better, having photos. Knowing where the distribution of the plant problem is on the plant itself and within the habitat. Talking about timing, when did this plant problem first appear? How long has it been going on? Checking if problems are normal for this particular plant species. We'll also talk about this. Reviewing plant care. Now, we don't want to be accusatory, especially if we're working with a client, but it's about asking those questions, getting curious, wondering how often they're watering their plant, maybe if they have applied any chemicals such as fertilizers recently or within the past couple growing seasons. Reviewing the site itself and environmental conditions. Maybe we had a recent weather event that could have affected the plant. Reviewing previous plant problems. Is this a historical problem they're seeing every year at this time of year? Is this something new? And then looking for signs and symptoms. This is when we'll delve into particular signs and symptoms for insects and mites. So host plant identification. What plant is it? And when it comes to working with our clients or even ourselves, if we're not super savvy on plant identification, no worries. There are a lot of credible resources we can use out there. After today's class, I'm going to send out a reference guide for credible resources when it comes to plant identification and plant diagnostics. And so that's where photos can be really helpful. And we have a wonderful service called Ask Extension with the University of Maryland where you can submit photos. We can help you with this as well. But if you're working with a client, have them bring as many photos as possible, especially if they don't know the identification of the plant that they're seeing the problem on. So the more specific, the better. Knowing what is normal for that particular type of plant, whether it be the genus or the species, talking about taxonomic or scientific name can be really important. Knowing what's normal for it, maybe year round, maybe it's normal for it to have that coloration on its leaves year round or a particular time of year. And one example of this on our top left, we have a variegated pyrus. I'm saying that correctly, but we have lots of different types of plant cultivars and varieties, and some of them have a usual yellowing or different coloration on the leaves that we might not be used to seeing. And so some people can misdiagnose this as a plant problem. Maybe they think there is a disease going on with their plant, but sometimes this is normal depending on the type of plant it is. Also, our example of our bumpy pumpkin over on our right, this is called a knucklehead pumpkin. Some people might see this pumpkin and think it also has some sort of disease or problem going on, but this is normal to have these ridges for this particular type of pumpkin. Also, seasonable things when it comes to physiology of our plant changing and growing through the different seasons and times of year. We get a lot of questions typically in the springtime when it comes to magnolias. People see lots of leaves dropping from their magnolia. They get worried that their magnolia is unhealthy, there's something going on. But leaf drop is normal for magnolias in the springtime as they prepare to put all their energy into blooming their beautiful flowers. And so with this, the more we know about the plant, we can use credible resources to look up what's normal for the morphology of our plant, the colors, the shapes, the growth forms, and the sizes, and also talking about seasonality with leaf drop potentially, bloom period, and so on. The other thing we can do is to look up common pests and pathogens. This can be really helpful to help narrow down our list of potential culprits or causal agents. And so we can look up common pests on oak trees, and it can also help us to narrow it down, again, using credible resources as we're referencing these different things. Reviewing plant care and conditions, thinking about the things that plants need to survive and to thrive. So things like water, sun, soil, thinking about the type of soil it is, and also thinking about soil moisture. Not all our plants will thrive in a very moist soil condition. Not all of our plants will thrive in a very dry soil condition. So that can be important. Again, playing into that, knowing what type of plant we have and its preferred growing conditions. Also talking about wind and thinking about what's around our plant. Is it being sheltered by a structure? Is it being overcrowded by plants around it? And then talking about those inputs. What has someone or maybe a landscaper applied to this particular plant recently or historically in the past? Thinking about things like fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and other chemicals. Even thinking about home remedies. With extension, we do not recommend applying home remedies as they're not science-based. But when we're talking with a client, again, not being accusatory, but getting curious, asking questions, asking what they may have applied recently. Maybe that may be some soap shavings or other things, just getting a feeling of what could have been applied to this plant. I have an example here of a picture of a pumpkin leaf, and we see something going on with that leaf tissue. We're seeing some lightning. We're wondering what's going on. Maybe a client approaches you with this picture and asks, what's happening with my pumpkin leaf? Now, we might think it's some sort of disease or maybe plant pest, but what's actually happening here is someone nearby had sprayed some herbicides, chemical that targets our weeds, and it accidentally drifted over and landed onto our pumpkin leaves, causing this burn or injury to our pumpkin leaf. It's important not only to know what's applied to our plants, but maybe surrounding our plants as well, as it's common to have some drift depending on the conditions from different chemicals. When we're trying to differentiate a living causal agent versus a non-living causal agent, some examples of non-living include weather, salt being applied to the roads, maybe someone ran into their tree with their lawnmower by accident. So non-living things that may have caused the damage to a particular plant versus our living. So our living we call biotic causal agents. So these are things like infectious disease and insects. We can look for patterns to help us get a sense of differentiating between these two. As we'll see in a little bit, there's always an exception to the rule, But I wanted to bring this up today to encourage you to look for patterns, because when we're looking for patterns, we're looking more closely. We're looking not only at the patterns on the plant itself, but patterns surrounding the plant and other plants around it. And so this is a key part of plant diagnostics, looking for different clues, looking for patterns. So generally, when we're talking about living causal agents, they'll typically show a random damage pattern versus a uniform one. So randomly scattered damage patterns, maybe that's random chewing, maybe it's random yellowing. It often affects only one plant species. Not all plants show symptoms, and symptoms spreads over time as that pest or pathogen spreads. Versus on our right with our uniform patterns, generally caused by our non-infectious problems, our non-living ones like climate, typically more uniform in distribution, where we're seeing a uniform, say, burn across several shrubs, often affect many plant species, so many different types of species of plants. Frequently, all plants in the problem area show injury, and then symptoms usually do not progress. So these are just some general guidelines to think about. We're going to go through a couple examples that kind of break this pattern rule, as we'll say. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a rule, but something to observe and to look out for. So again, general guideline, there's always exceptions to the rule. So we'll take a look at our first example, and you can think to yourself, you can write in the chat to talk with our other participants. If you think the particular damage we're seeing to these bushes here or shrubs is caused by a biotic or living causal agent or an abiotic non-living one. So take a guess, no worries about right or wrong. We're getting curious here. We're practicing our plant diagnostic skills. I want you to not only look at the plant itself, but looking around it. What structures are we seeing? Are we seeing pathways? Are we seeing a road nearby? Awesome. So I'm going to reveal our answer. This was caused by an abiotic, a non-living causal agent, specifically salt damage on yews. So during the cold winter months, it's common we put down salt on our sidewalks and our roads to make sure they're not icy and slippery for our different people using these walkways. And so common thing we'll typically see if we have plants right next to a walkway or road is we're seeing this burn caused by salt splashing up onto those particular plants. We can see here this follows our pattern that we just learned where we're seeing a uniform damage pattern across multiple plants in a particular damage zone, as we call it, or particular area. Next example one. What do we think? Biotic or abiotic? So some of this might be a common sight for some of us. Unfortunately, our culprit is a deer or even multiple deer. And so these are arborvitaes, common sight to see where we see on the lower portion of our arborvitae, the reachable height and feeding height for our deer, we see all the foliage chewed away. And so even though we're seeing this uniform pattern here, this is the exception to the rule. This is a common sight we see in pattern for when we're seeing deer damage on our arborvitae. Next one, we have a rose plant here. We're taking a look at the rose leaves. Something unusual with the leaves that we're seeing. What do we think, biotic or abiotic? Seeing some awesome guesses in the chat. So this is caused by a biotic. So we are following our earlier pattern where we're seeing a little bit more random damage. Someone could argue that it's a little bit more uniform, but again, it depends on how you interpret and view the situation. But we're seeing a little bit more random of a patterning on the leaves themselves. We're seeing what we call this chlorotic line patterns. We're seeing yellowing of our green leaf tissue, and this is caused by rose mosaic virus. So a living thing, a pathogen. And this is our final example today. Practice our diagnostic skills. What do we think here? We have, is it biotic or abiotic causal agent? This one's a little bit of a tricky one, I would say. Thank you for your guesses. Okay, I'm going to reveal our answer here. There we go. So this is caused by abiotic, non-living. This is what we see as winter damage or burn to some of the distal ends, the top ends of our evergreen. Typically, if we're having significant amounts of snow stay on top of our plant tissue, we can see this as well as wind damage. And so that is, depending on how we're looking at it, seeing a more uniform pattern can also be interpreted as a little bit more random as well. So just wanted to show that we want to observe our patterns, but there isn't necessarily a go-to rule to definitively know if we're having a non-living or a living causal agent, but encourages us to get curious and to ask more questions. Gathering as much relevant information as we can. Again, we're plant detectives. We want to create our file and get as many clues, as much evidence as we can, using those credible resources, talking with our client, if we're working with ourselves and our own plants, looking around us and gathering that information. Another way we can think about developing a knowledge base, another way to look at it, is we can think about it as we're looking big picture and narrowing in, or if we want to think about it in our minds a little bit more of is narrowing in and zooming out. And so the three settings I would say that we can look at it, or three aspects or perspectives, include big picture habitat, narrowing in on the plant itself, where we are seeing the plant problem on, and then zooming in even further and observing that plant problem. Maybe we're seeing nearby clues, whether that be the insect itself, maybe we're seeing other insects nearby, different life stages, different insect products such as silk or even excrement, which we call frass for our insects. Or maybe we observe the closer in perspective first. We're seeing that plant problem, we're observing different items around it and clues. Then we need to maybe take a step back, look at the plant itself, talking about plant identification, surrounding area, the soil, the different inputs it's getting, water, sun, maybe nearby wind and the climate, and then zooming out even further than that, gathering information about the habitat it's in. So just another way to think about it when we're building our plant diagnostic skills. So today we're going to delve into looking at our signs and symptoms for insects and mites. We get to our third topic of recognizing plant damage caused by insects and mites. So recognizing signs and symptoms. What is a sign? A sign is the organism itself. So when we're talking about insects and mites, it's the insect itself, any life stage of that insect. It's the mite itself, or maybe it's a product that is created by that organism. So that could be things like excrement, which we call frass. It could be silk. It could be different life stages. So it could be insect eggs. It could be shed skins. With some of our insects, they molt. And so they shed their skin and grow bigger into a new exoskeleton. So we'll go through some of these signs today, which we call products as our damage category. And then we'll learn about symptoms. So symptoms are a visible effect or damage, and it can be changes in appearance of our plant or changes in growth. So something we find unusual for our plant can be labeled as a symptom. So things like chewing on the leaves, or maybe we're seeing lightening of the leaves. Sign, the insect, the culprit itself, or some sort of product that's coming from the culprit. And then our symptom is our visible effect or damage, typically caused by, when we're talking about our insects, feeding. So the insect feeding causing some sort of symptom. So recognizing signs and symptoms. All insects feed, and therefore they leave behind signs and symptoms. These are our clues when we're talking about plant diagnostics. A single pest may cause symptoms or signs in more than one category. So we're going to go through 5 main categories today, such as chewing, but we could have a particular insect species that could chew our plants, and they could also leave behind our last category of a product. And so just because we have chewing doesn't mean that's the only thing that a particular insect can do to our plant. And then vice versa, if we're seeing chewing on our plant, it is not specific to one species of insect. We could have multiple species of insect that can chew or even cause different types of chewing. Typically, when we're talking about distinctive signs and symptoms, it's a combination of several different signs and symptoms that we're seeing to help confirm a particular culprit. That makes sense. So we could have, say, multiple types of caterpillars that have the same similar chewing that we could see on a leaf. But if we see chewing, we see silk webbing. Not all caterpillars produce silk webbing. Maybe we find one of the caterpillars themselves. That leads us more and more, gives us more clues to help us with our plant diagnostics. So today we're going to review these different categories and types to help us to begin to recognize some of these things that we can see in our own green spaces. So if you have your handout with you today, if you don't, no worries. I did include it in the chat earlier. It's a PDF. And if you don't have it accessible with you right now, no worries. We're going to walk through all the information that's listed on here, and I'll make sure you get one after today's class. But if you do have it with you, get it out and ready, as we'll be going through it and referencing it. So these are all the categories that are outlined on the handout. We have 5 categories of plant damage that can be caused by an insect or a mite. That includes chewed, discolored, distorted, dieback, and products. And then we have different types underneath each category. So we're going to go through most of the types. When it comes to our products, we won't have time to go through all of them. So if there is a particular type that's listed on there, or that you find that you want a better example of, feel free to reach out to me after today's class. So when it comes to the insect itself, the type of mouth part it has informs what type of damage it can cause. And when it comes to insects that damage our plants, that feed on plants, there are 2 main mouth parts. There are more than just these 2 mouth parts that insects can have, but the 2 main ones when we're talking about insects that damage our plants include chewing mouth parts, like our orange-striped oakworm that we see on the right here, chewing on a leaf. And then the other type is called piercing sucking, or we can also refer to it as a straw-like mouth part. So here are chewing mouth parts. This is a diagram of a grasshopper, the front of the face, and the different parts that make up its mouth part. Typically with our chewing insects, we have well-developed mandibles. So these are typically the part of the mouth that will help to chew and to cut plant tissue. Here's a video of one of the university's Madagascar hissing roaches from the insect zoo, and we can see its chewing mouth parts as it is feeding on a cucumber. There are other types of insects that have chewing mouth parts, like beetles, grasshoppers, caterpillars. Those can be moth or butterfly larvae, and sawfly larvae. So sawflies are a type of wasp. Our other type of main mouth part, piercing sucking. So as I refer to it as like a giant straw coming down from the front of the insect's face. So with our piercing sucking insects, they cannot physically chew plants. So when we note what type of insect we have, or we're seeing damage, as we'll learn from piercing sucking insects, it can't be caused by an insect that has chewing mouth parts. It's all about learning about the physiology here. We'll learn more about insect ID and learning about the different types of our insects next month. But this is just a little introduction. We're talking about plant damage and our insect mouth parts. So piercing sucking, we have a diagram here. We can see this long appendage coming down from the face is this straw-like mouth part. It has what we call stylets in there, which is the sucky portions where they pierce the plant tissue with the straw-like mouth part, typically tapping into the vascular tissue of our plants, which we call our phloem or our xylem, and they're sucking up the nutrients from that vascular tissue. Typically a very sugary substance, so lots of sugary nutrients here. They're sucking it up. Sometimes while they're doing this, they're sucking up the chlorophyll, which makes our plants green. And so what we'll see in a little bit is one type of damage from our piercing sucking insects is to see yellowing of the plant tissue. When they're tapping that straw into the plant tissue, they're sucking up some of that chlorophyll with it and lightening our plant tissue. So in this video, we have a milkweed bug nymph that I found in my local community garden, and we can see its straw-like mouth parts kind of tapping away on the top of this leaf, probably looking for some milkweed seeds. It's preferred food. But we can see it almost looks like another limb or leg, but it's coming down from the front of the face. Some of our piercing sucking insects will even rest this proboscis or straw-like mouth part along the center of their chest when they're not feeding. But other insects that have piercing sucking mouth parts include mites, true bugs like our cicadas, hoppers, aphids, and scale insects. So now we'll get into our different categories and types. We're going to look at pictures of each of these. If we do go through these a little fast for you, we are recording this, so you can feel free to refer back to these different examples, especially as we begin to explore our own green spaces and begin to recognize these different types of plant damage. So we'll first get into our damage category of chewed. If we look at the top of our handout, if we have it with us, and then we're going to see A through E is the different types of chewing damage that we can see. And the groups of leaf chewing insects can include larvae of moths and butterflies, which are known as caterpillars, sawfly larvae, so sawflies are wasps, so that's kind of cool, beetle larvae or adults, tree crickets, grasshoppers, and walking sticks. So these are just some examples. And then some non-arthropod animals that can perform similar chewing damage include snails and slugs. So here's our first type, number A, if we're looking at our handout, defoliation. And so when it comes to our defoliation, we can see that they're chewing all different parts of our leaves. So they're not picky eaters with our insects that cause defoliation. They're eating the leaf veins, the margins, the midrib. What you'll notice if we're referencing our handout today, we have some guided questions that you can begin to answer as we go through some of these to get you thinking. And so we can see with defoliation, sometimes they will leave part of the mid vein or center part of our leaves, but generally at this stage, they have well-developed mandibles, typically late-stage caterpillars, and they're eating the entire leaf as much as they can. Our next type is called shot hole. So we're just the insect itself is just chewing little holes in our leaves. We can see an example of flea beetle feeding either on what looks like a radish leaf or a rocket leaf on our left. And then on our right, we have early stage or young stage spongy moth caterpillars creating these smaller chewed holes. As they're younger, they have smaller mandibles at this stage. Next, we have margins notched. This one's kind of fun one to spot. Most of the time when we're seeing just the edges notched, as we'll see with our left photo here, this is caused by a beetle called a weevil. We'll see a little bit closer up of what weevils look like with their elongated rostrum, which makes them look like they have a long nose. But I find these kind of fun to spot when we're seeing just the edges notched. And then we also have another native bee that can cause margins notched, but theirs is a little bit more distinctive where we're seeing about quarter-sized circles, perfect circles being cut from the outsides of leaves. They really like eastern redbud leaves, so we can see that on our right picture. And these native bees, beneficial pollinators in our landscapes, they're collecting this leaf tissue. They're using their mandibles, chewing this perfect little circle. They're bringing this leaf disc to the nest that they're creating for their young. So they create these little chambers, stacking up these little discs of leaves to create a nice cozy chamber to rear her young in. So if you're seeing this in your landscape, it isn't significant damage to your plant. It's a good thing you're knowing that your environment is supporting native bees, which is really, really awesome. We're talking about our weevils, which can be a pest. Weevil, we can see one type of weevil on our left. This is called the black vine weevil, which is pretty common to our area. We can see the head right here, the eyes, and then the two antennae coming out from their rostrum, the elongated part of their face. And at the end of their rostrum is their mouth parts. It actually took me a while to learn this when I was in school. I thought their mouth part would be back there. This is their nose, but at the end of this rostrum is this little mouth part. Some of our weevils have really long ones, which is kind of crazy, but that makes sense, right? This is why we're seeing just the margins, the edges of our leaves chewed. We can see that in our video on our right. We have a weevil here that's chewing on the edge of our leaf. Little mouth part at the end of that rostrum, chewing away. So kind of cool to spot. Next, we have skeletonization, very common for Japanese beetles to do this. They're feeding in between the veins of our leaves. So they're not chewing on veins typically, unless they have chewed between the veins and it naturally breaks because it's weakened, and they're not chewing on that mid vein. So we get this skeletonized version of our leaf. Another common beetle that does this is elm leaf beetle, as we can see on our right. Etching. Etching is where we're just the insect itself is chewing one layer of our leaf. We can confirm this if we hold the damaged leaf up to a light, such as the sun. We can see through it. So we can see it's almost like stained glass. They're just removing one layer of the leaf. And one common culprit of this is called oak skeletonizer, which can be a little confusing because our oak skeletonizers etch, they don't skeletonize, but can be a little trick to keep in our mind. We can see what the oak skeletonizer caterpillar looks like on our middle bottom part of our slides here. It turns into a moth. So pretty common sight to see on our oak trees. Our next category we have is discolored. Oh, I do see the question in the chat, is etching the same as window painting? I think that might be another way to refer to it as. I would have to confirm what people would usually ID window painting as. It sounds similar to me. As long as we're referring to window painting as that one layer of our leaf being removed and we're still having a layer left. Another way we can talk about it. Next category is discolored. We have our different types. Common arthropods causing discoloration include spider mites, lace bugs, thrips, beetlefly and sawfly leaf miners, and then things like aphids, whiteflies, and mealybugs, as we'll see. So this is stippling. We're looking at the leaf tissue. Sometimes to see stippling, we'll need a magnifier. So that could be a magnifying glass, or I highly recommend getting a hand lens if we're getting into plant diagnostics. Some of these things are really small for us to see. So if we're holding up our hand lens, we're taking a look, we can see individual, almost look like little pinpricks of discoloration on our leaf tissue. So we're thinking this is our piercing sucking insects. They're sucking up individual plant cells and the contents, and then they're leaving behind this discoloration. And so common culprit of this is two-spotted spider mite, as we can see on our right on common beans. And when we're seeing a cluster of stippling, we can see broader yellowing patterns as we see more and more feeding. We can also view stippling on individual pine needles if we zoom in up close. We have a heavy infestation of lace bugs, and they're stippling feeding here, causing a lightening of the leaf tissue. And then we have stippling of our four-lined plant bug. They have bigger stipples. Pretty common on our herbs. We can also find this type of stippling on our basil as well. We have our thrips, which are a really tiny type of insect. They produce a damage similar to piercing sucking insects, but we call their mouth parts rasping because they have one part of their mouth part that will scrape the leaf tissue and another part that will suck it up. So we call this a rasping mouth part. And so their damage is a little bit more longer streaks. Instead of individual dot stipples, they create a streak of lightening of the tissue as they suck up the contents. We also have mining. We have lots of examples. For sake of time, my apologies if I'm going a little fast, but mining is very unique. There are lots of different shapes, colors, and sizes depending on the insect itself. A newer one we're seeing in our vegetable gardens include allium leaf miner on onion leaves on our top left. Another examples, another common one is boxwood leaf miner. And then our last type of yellowing. So we can have yellowing from a significant piercing, sucking, feeding from our aphids, or other things like our scale insects, as we can see on our right. Next, we have distorted types of insects that can cause distortion, where we're seeing leaf cupping or deformation. We'll also get into galls on leaves and stems. So things like aphids, flies, mites, caterpillars, and then we're talking about bark rippling and cracking. We're talking about wood-boring beetles. So first thing is leaf cupping. So we're actually making little cups out of the leaves. This is from typically feeding on newer, younger tissue. This is an example on boxwoods. This is caused by boxwood psyllid. Usually if we're seeing cupping and then we're seeing white wax, as we can see on our right, good indication that we likely have boxwood psyllids. So we can see on the tips, this cupping type formation caused by piercing, sucking, feeding from insects. We can also see leaf curling and deformation from aphids on various different types of plants. Again, they're typically targeting that young, tender, new growth. And so since it's new growth, it's formed, deformed, curled from this piercing, sucking, feeding. We also have leaf curling. This is common on honey locust with our honey locust plant bug. We can see typically young leaves. They form and grow curled and deformed from piercing, sucking, feeding. And then talking about leaf galls, just like with our leaf mining, very unique. There are lots of different types out there. Some of them can be very unique and help really to identify the culprit itself, and some of them may be more common. But we can see different types of examples here, different growths on the leaves that we can spot. And in these galls, when we're talking about galls made by insects, there is an insect inside of that gall. And so this is an example of a gall that was broken open. We're zoomed in really close, and inside are a bunch of little mites, which we call eriophyid mites. With some of our galls, especially the ones made by flies and wasps, there's usually one insect inside each gall. It creates a little house for them where they're feeding and protected until they finish their development. But when it comes to our mites, there's typically a lot of mites within one particular growth or gall. As a little note, our galls typically don't cause a lot of damage. They're just an aesthetic damage. So I think it's a cool decoration to our leaves if you find them out there. And then we have things like twig and stem galls caused by insects, all different types of growths that we can spot. And then we'll lead to dieback. So the first thing we'll talk about is shoot dieback. So just the tip of our shoots are dying off. One classic example of this, especially if we remember back to our Brood X periodical cicada emergence, if we had that in our area, we may have noticed after the emergence, a lot of tips of our trees were breaking off, or we see a lightening of the leaves, meaning that tip broke off, as we see in this picture here. We call this flagging. And this was particularly caused by our cicadas. They have a strong ovipositor and egg-laying appendage that cuts little slits into pencil-thin branches. And when they cut the slit, they lay their eggs inside. That slit can be a weak area of our branch. And so with a strong wind or weather condition, that can sometimes break off and indicate some sort of damage from an insect. In this case, it was egg-laying scars from our cicadas. We can also have branch dieback. So we're having dieback from multiple branches, not just the shoot tips. This is commonly seen with emerald ash borer. We're seeing damage within the tree itself feeding from this particular invasive beetle. An indicator of this tree being infested is we're seeing dieback of the canopy. We're seeing less leaves in the canopy. We can also see this with really heavy infestations of scale insects that are covering and feeding on the tree itself. Girdling at the crown and branches. So girdling is when we have chewing around a circular fashion around, again, the crown or the base of our plant or on particular branches. So this can happen underground with our roots, or it can happen above ground with our trunks and branches. And so when they chew this circular way, this girdling motion around it, they're chewing some vital or parts of our plants like vascular tissues that will inhibit the flow of vital nutrients to different parts of the plant. So if you imagine you're chewing away all this layers of leaf tissue, they're going to stop flow of nutrients between that plant. We call that girdling, which can lead ultimately to plant death. And so this can happen below ground from things like larvae or immature stages of black vine weevil, or even above ground with beetles like our twig girdler, as we can see on our right here. Galleries under bark is an indicator of some sort of wood-boring insect. A lot of the time it could be a beetle, or we also have wood wasps that will do this. So these are just two examples. If we had significant damage and our bark is falling away, we might see some galleries underneath, as we call this. So galleries formed by things with chewing mouth parts as they're chewing these different little passageways to move within the woody tissue. On our left, we have an example of European elm bark beetle, and on our right, we have an example of emerald ash borer beetle. Bark cracking. So if we don't have the bark falling away, typically if we're seeing cracking, that could be an indicator that we are having galleries and boring underneath that bark, because when they're moving around underneath that bark, it can lead to cracking and fracturing from the outside perspective of our woody plant. So this is cracking that's caused by emerald ash borer, as we can see in this photo. With our wood-boring insects, typically they spend their immature stages inside of the woody tissue itself, so inside the branches and the trunk, and then they finish their development and they'll emerge as an adult. So they need to exit the tree or the woody plant. And so they cause exit holes, which could be a symptom to show us that there was a boring insect inside of that plant. And so we have two different borer exit hole examples. We have emerald ash borer exit holes on our left, and then our native longhorn beetle exit holes on our right. Exit holes can vary in shape and size. We can even have tiny ones. Some of our bark beetles are as small as a grain of rice or even smaller, so they can create really tiny exit holes as they emerge. So it's going to depend on the insect size itself. Okay, we're getting into our insect products. I see we are coming up on 1 o'clock, so if you do have to leave us for today, then no worries. We'll post and share the recording so you can reference and look at all the insect products. But if you can stick around with us, great. We'll go through some of these insect products so you can begin to recognize them within your own green spaces. We'll start with honeydew, a pretty common one. This is produced by our piercing sucking insects that feed on sugary plant sap. So honeydew is their excrement, the byproduct of their feeding. We can call this insect pee. Very sugary and lands on anything that's below that insect. So we can see what that looks like sticky on the surface of our leaf and our middle part here. And when we have honeydew, this can lead to what we call sooty mold growth, because this honeydew is very sugary, can lead to mold growth on maybe leaf tissue if we have honeydew dripping down onto leaf tissue. The sooty mold is black or dark in coloration, and because of this, it can block sunlight and then inhibit photosynthesis for our plants, especially if we have a lot of honeydew and a lot of sooty mold growing on plant tissue. Fecal spots. So some of our insects produce very tar, sticky, like fecal spots on our plants. This can be really common when we see lace bugs. If we flip the leaf over, like our azalea or our rhododendron leaves, and then we see these tar-like black spots, these are fecal spots or excrement created by our lace bugs. And then on our right, we can see examples of fecal spots produced by things like thrips, like our western flower thrip. So this can be a sign, as we learned it, an indicator or product produced by our insect, that something was there. Sawdust. So when we're talking about our wood-boring insects, as they're feeding, they can push out the sawdust from their feeding, their byproduct. And typically within the sawdust, if we were to look really closely, maybe we have a microscope or a hand lens, we could spot some frass or excrement within the sawdust as well. So typically a sign, if we're seeing it, especially around the base of a woody plant, that there are wood-boring insects inside. Do fecal spots damage plants? If there was a heavy covering of fecal spots over the plant, it could, I would guess, limit the photosynthesis abilities of our plant tissue, blocking sunlight, especially if it's sticky and tar-like. It could also inhibit gas exchange with our plants. I don't know if someone has probably researched this before. I would have to look into it more, but fecal spots could potentially damage plants, especially if we have a lot of them covering the plant tissue. Products, we have silk and protective cases. This time of year, we're potentially seeing silk web tents on the distal ends of branches produced by caterpillars. We could see bagworms beginning to create their protective bag, attaching to different plants and even fences and surfaces as they spend the winter months in their protective bag, indicator that that particular caterpillar is there. White wax is pretty common for lots of different types of insects. On our top left, we see woolly hackberry aphids on hackberry leaves. So they have fluffy white wax on themselves, which helps them to maintain moisture and as protection. We can see them leaving this wax behind on the leaf tissue. On our bottom left, we have mealybugs, which again, waxy themselves and also leave waxy material behind. On our middle, we have Indian wax scale. So this is a soft wax that they cover their body with for protection. And then on our right, we have hemlock woolly adelgid, which can sometimes look like snow or bird excrement on our hemlock trees. But this particular fluffy white waxy substance that they create is for protection for themselves and protection for their eggs and their young. Pitch tube can also be an indicator of wood-boring insect. It's a sap mass out of a particular area where there was feeding or even an exit hole. And then we can have things like eggs and shed skins. Eggs can be just as diverse as the active stages of the insects themselves. Egg identification is a favorite of mine that can be really tricky because there's lots of different types of insects and thus lots of different types of eggs out there. Things like our stink bug eggs, as we can see in our middle. Stink bug eggs can come in all different types of colors and patterns, but they're typically barrel shaped and like in a cluster together. We also see clusters with some of our caterpillars, like our Easton tent caterpillar egg mass seen on our right. And then insect eggs themselves can also be laid singly. They aren't always laid in a mass like that. Some of our moth caterpillars are laid just a single egg, like our Polyphemus moth. Or we can have eggs that are laid singly, but typically with many of them laid together on a leaf tissue, like our squash bug eggs, as we can see on our bottom left. Since some of our insects molt as they grow bigger and bigger, they will leave behind shed skins. This can be a great sign that a particular insect was present. Plant hoppers do this pretty commonly. So if we flip a leaf over and we see maybe one of these shed skins, as we can see on our top left with our hand lens, that could be an indicator that we had plant hopper with its piercing sucking mouth parts potentially feeding on our plant. Awesome. With that, I hope you will be able to go out into your own green spaces and to begin to recognize some of these insect and might cause plant damage categories and types. And so with that, we'll lead into our practicing our diagnostic skills. And so as you come away from today's presentation, I hope you reference the handout that I sent out. Again, if you did not receive it, feel free to email me. I'll have my email at the end of today's presentation. Go out in your own green spaces, and I'm going to encourage you all to do this through a bingo game that I will email out by the end of this week, as well as a more of a reflective quiz to test your diagnostic skills as well. This isn't graded, isn't weighted against you in any way, but more of a reflective point to test your knowledge and skill. So 2 different ways you can do this through the bingo game. You can do this with peers, friends, and family as you're going out in your own green spaces, looking for different types of damage from insects and mites. And then also an option for an online quiz as well. As you're going through either of these, especially when you're going your own green spaces, if you have a tricky one, you can't categorize it into one, or if you're wondering if it's not caused by insects or mites, feel free to send me an email. Use me as a resource. If you are a master gardener volunteer, use your coordinator as a resource if you have questions and you're practicing your diagnostic skills as you go along. So I will email both the bingo card and the quiz out soon. So thank you for sticking around today. Going to conclude with some key takeaways. Anyone can practice and build upon your plant diagnostic skills as you're all doing today. Plant diagnostics can be done year-round wherever there are plants and plant problems. Gather as much relevant information as you can to inform your diagnostic process, utilizing credible resources. Identifying and present signs and symptoms can help with an accurate causal agent identification, as we learned to recognize some today. And there are common insect plant damage categories and types to look for and recognize within our own green spaces. So go out there, get curious, explore, be your own plant detective. I promise you they're out there even as we're getting into fall. I guarantee you can find just about all of these plant damage categories and types out there if you look closely enough. So if you're still with us, thank you for sticking around. I'm going to post our post quiz. Feel free to fill that out to check in with yourself. Questions are going to look very similar to our pre-quiz. Little check-in after we've absorbed all of our plant diagnostic information. A little reminder as you're filling out that post quiz about our schedule. So the next time we will be meeting is October 9th, and we'll be talking about insect identification. But between now and then, practice those diagnostic skills, utilize the bingo game, the online quiz, explore. If you have any questions, feel free to email me photos if you want to confirm your identification, kind of bounce off ideas with your diagnostic process, feel free to do so. And also utilize people around you. If you're a master gardener, reach out to people within your county, and you can do this yourself, walk through your own community and demonstration gardens. So with that, I'm happy to stick around for questions. But you can always feel free to email me after today. And I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat as well.
Thanks, Maddie. I'm getting a lot of positive feedback in the chat. So it seems like everybody really enjoyed today's presentation.
Awesome.
There's a couple questions in the Q&A. How is leaf cupping different from leaf curling, as in tomato leaves in hot, dry weather?
Ooh, that's a good question. So with leaf curling with our tomato leaves, so that's caused not by a biotic or a living causal agent, as you probably know in reference, it's from that hot weather. When we're talking about these different types of damage categories and types, we're describing what we're seeing on our plant. So we could see curling and deformation from, say, plant pathogens or even abiotic non-living causal agents. These particular categories and types are describing common things that we could see with our insect and mite damage. And so differentiating our cupping versus our curling can be a little bit tricky. As with nature and with variety of feeding, we could see something that looks more like cupping, looks like more like curling. But generally with our cupping, like we saw with our boxwood example there, it forms almost like a little bowl versus maybe just curling to the side. Especially when we see this with boxwoods, they have pretty sturdy leaves, and so they can really create this formed shape, cupping. Pretty distinctive with boxwood psyllid, they typically create this. And then with our curling or deformation of our leaf tissue, especially with our newer growth, indicates that we had some sort of insect as that piercing sucking mouth part, and they're feeding on that tender growth, causing it to deform as it grows and develops. And so sometimes in some cases, we can't definitively label it as a particular type. It can be a little bit tricky, but again, it's a part of our diagnostic process to help us narrow down the potential culprits and get us more and more information.
Awesome. One person says, I have some fruit plants with rust on one and some curling on the other. I removed all affected leaves. What else can I do?
I would have to get back to you about the rust, knowing what is the best control measures for that. You can feel free to reach out to us at Ask Extension 2. It's good that you did remove the infested tissue. It's typically what we recommend with a lot of our pathogens, and making sure to trash it and not to compost it would also be really important. And to disinfect any tools that you're using as well.
What is a good insect ID app?
Ooh. The ones that I commonly use to begin my insect identification are things like Google Lens and iNaturalist. I would say with any sort of identification app for any plant or insect, it's someplace to start. In my experience, sometimes it's really good at identifying something correctly, and sometimes it's really bad at identifying something correctly. So it can get you on a path to starting, but I would use it as a base point, as a reference, and then using more credible resources as you're going along. A lot of the times when you're using those apps, especially things like Google Lens, it leads you to links. And so you can follow those links, make sure they're credible to look up further identification traits and resources to use.
Is there an answer key to the questions in your handout?
Yes, I can be sure to send that around with the bingo game and the other online quiz.
Okay. Are you going to send the resources list as well?
Yes, yes. Thank you for reminding me of that. I will be sure to send the resources list as well. And that will include both print resources and online resources. So whatever you prefer.
All right. Our last question is, how do they access the webinar recording?
Yes, that'll be a good question. I'll be sure to email that out of where we will host it on the Master Gardener website, or if we want to post it to our Home and Garden Information Center YouTube page, wherever it will fit best. Either way, I'll make sure to email out the link to everyone who has registered for the webinar series. So we'll make sure to get that to you soon. If it's a week has gone by, 2 weeks, feel free to reach out to me if you didn't get the recording.
Awesome. That's everything.
Awesome. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, everyone. Feel free to reach out with questions, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.